Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Global Hotspots podcast. I'm your host for today, Miloš Majore, and I'll be talking to my colleagues Andrew Loftusness, Jared Jeter, and Sebastian Ditkin about some of the main developments from the previous quarter related to geopolitical hotspots and their implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. As always, you can find a more in-depth analysis and forecast of these topics in our quarterly report, the brand new Q3 quarterly report. You can find an executive summary of the report at newlinesinstitute.org, or get the report in full once you register to our geopolitical forecasting platform on our website. In today's episode, the first of two parts related to our Q3 coverage, we will be starting off with reviewing our main geopolitical hotspots, namely the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific, the Americas, and the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We will then turn our attention in a follow-up episode to some of the other covered hotspots across the world. So let's kick things off today, gentlemen, with perhaps one of the most active and consequential hotspots from this past quarter, namely the Middle East. So Andrew, you've had a lot of work this past quarter covering the region. Can you start off by giving us a quick reminder of what's been happening throughout Q2?
Yeah, so the region was dominated by military escalation for most of the quarter, not the entirety of it. We'll get into that in a second. But if I may briefly step back into the very end of Q1 when the U.S. and Israel killed the previous Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and the opening strikes of their war against Iran. That, of course, kicked off that war, and then about 48 hours later, Hezbollah fired rockets into northern Israel, which led to a massive Israeli retaliation that is continuing up until now at the time of recording, despite numerous ceasefires, and that has seen the Israeli army occupy land north of the Litani River, displacing over 1 million and killing over 4,000 to date. Now, bringing it back to the U.S. and Iran specifically, there was a trend towards de-escalation finally in April when the U.S. and Iran agreed to a Pakistani-mediated ceasefire and begun a series of negotiations, which leads us to where we are today with not quite a peace deal or a permanent agreement to end the war, but a memorandum of understanding and a series of on-again, off-again talks between the U.S. and Iran, primarily in Geneva.
Yeah, so obviously a lot to take into account from this past quarter on multiple fronts, whether it be Iran and in the Levant. And now looking forward to Q3, Andrew, we've talked a lot in previous episodes on the developments related to the ceasefire negotiations, with mixed signals coming through in terms of the possible success that these will have going forwards. So looking on to the next 3 months, taking that broader view, what do you think is the most likely scenario that we're going to see? Are we going to continue on this diplomatic de-escalation route, or is there a chance of things spiraling out of control yet again?
We will likely continue on a very rocky path of de-escalation. So the main thing to keep in mind looking at the next quarter of the year is that none of those conflicts that we just discussed and that we have been discussing for the last few months have been resolved. Now, a number of them, the two most important ones, arguably, the war between the U.S., Israel, and Iran, and Israel and Hezbollah and Lebanon are arguably better, right? Defining that as closer to a permanent de-escalation and a permanent peace deal in the case of the U.S. and Iran. But nothing is guaranteed. So it's certainly more likely that we will see a permanent deal between the U.S. and Iran at some point during this quarter, but significant questions remain about the future of the nuclear program, which is really what it all comes down to, as well as the future of Israel's occupation in Lebanon. And again, that's one of those things where At this point, there's a significant divergence of interest with the U.S. and Israel when it comes to negotiations in Iran and Israel's continued occupation in Lebanon. And for that matter, you could argue Gaza and Syria. The main issue at hand really is the nuclear question. The U.S. is very likely going to be okay leaving Iran's domestic missile production capabilities and their ability and their willingness to support their regional proxy network largely intact, at least for the sake of securing a more favorable nuclear deal. And obviously, that is directly counter to Israeli interests and at least some of the reasons why Israel went to war with the United States a few months ago.
Right. So obviously, we're likely to see a continued battle of wills, as it were, between Israel and the US going forwards. Clearly, either pushing towards continued military escalation or potentially that diplomatic de escalation continuing along. Very clearly, there's going to be a deviation from the status quo. But in terms of the hybrid escalation scenario, are we likely to see any further developments on that front?
I mean, on the hybrid front, that's always possible, right? Because I think that any state, and perhaps these ones in particular, are likely to pursue non-kinetic means to gain advantages over each other, even while negotiations are ongoing during at least a notional ceasefire. Now, it has to be said there has been de-escalation, so to speak, on the hybrid front as well recently, as the U.S. has agreed to release $300 billion of Iranian frozen assets as part of this memorandum of understanding. And then a quick word just on the military escalation scenario. Israel has made its intentions clear that it plans to continue to expand its occupation in Gaza up until at least 70% of the Palestinian territory, and that's a number that I'm citing from Netanyahu himself. And then, as of today, both the Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz and Netanyahu repeated comments that Israel intends to remain in Lebanon, Gaza, and Syria in what they call security zones. These are territorial occupations until, in the case of Lebanon, Hezbollah is disarmed and that territory is completely controlled by the Lebanese army. So that remains a serious point of contention that does have that there is a realistic chance that could completely derail what the U.S. is trying to accomplish in these talks in Geneva. And then the final thing that I'll note there is that the reason why there is likely to be a permanent peace deal is because Trump wants out of the war, right? So that will likely give him an American decision makers a higher tolerance for kinetic action from the Iranians against American positions throughout the region and against American allies in the region. These kinds of attacks that we see on a regular basis now and have become almost the rhythm of these so-called ceasefires are the types of things that are easily miscalculated. And they do have, a single incident does have the realistic potential to derail months of diplomatic efforts.
Yeah, of course. So something to really keep track on as the quarter progresses. And actually, on the point of Iran, I wanted to ask you about Iran a bit more specifically as it relates to. So, obviously, at the start of the war, a lot of what we were hearing from the United States was talk of possible regime change as being a possible war aim by the United States. And that was obviously linked to some serious internal security destabilization that we saw early on this year with mass protests across the country. Can you give us a sense of how the situation is currently and whether we're still in that destabilization scenario or how we're likely to see things moving forwards internally?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I think it's important to keep in mind, despite how things are going right now. And the case could be argued that Iran enters these negotiations with the upper hand, right? That they came out of the war very badly bloodied and bruised, but with the upper hand at the strategic level. That being said, it is still not a good time to be a senior Iranian government official, right? Even if and when any sort of existential threat from the U.S. and Israel is removed, they have severe problems that they have to worry about on the home front. Starting a while back that we saw recently boil to the surface with the mass uprisings in January, shortly before the start of the war. So those sentiments are still there among the population. Major Iranian cities, including Tehran itself, still face severe not only power outages but water shortages. The IRGC is likely going to emerge playing an even larger role in Iran's economic sector than they did before. Drought and inflation, sanctions, these things continue to pose significant threats to Iran's domestic political stability. Now, all that being said, Iran is likely to experience at least an initial shift towards political stabilization, primarily because the U.S. is no longer pursuing regime change, right? But what does that look like? Well, that will certainly come at the expense of the Iranian people themselves, as this is not getting a lot of attention in the news unless you follow this part of the world closely. But there is currently an escalated crackdown right now from the Iranian government against its own population. But anyone who has participated or is thought to have participated in the January protest, and a number of people who have been accused of being spies for the U.S. and Israel during the war. So again, there's likely to be at least an initial increase in political stabilization, but keep in mind what that actually looks like on the ground inside of Iran.
Yeah, and I suppose that Iran also wants some kind of end to the war, and as a result, does not want to be distracted by any kind of internal turmoil. So likely that internal pressure will continue. Well, thank you, Andrew. So I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about the United States more in detail, as obviously Iran wasn't the only front that the United States was involved with. There's also a lot of pressure and tensions with the United States neighborhood partners, in South America, in the Caribbean, and also across the Atlantic with its European partners. So quite a lot of fronts to cover here. But in brief, Jared, I wanted to bring you in here. Could you give us a reminder of how the past quarter went down from the America's point of view?
Yeah, thanks, Milos. So the United States generally trended toward escalation in Q2, and much of this was based around its changing dynamic and increasing escalation towards Cuba. The things that we saw predominantly is that really kind of ring some alarm bells. Is first we saw the classification of the former Cuban president as a criminal to be arrested. We saw the United States declare Cuba a national security threat, and we saw them build up military forces around the island. And if you remember back in Q1, these are the exact same tactics that were deployed against Venezuela just prior to American intervention. Now, of course, America is a little bit more distracted right now with the war with Iran. However, the type of tactics that we're seeing the United States deploy around Cuba, the type of asymmetrical warfare and even physical blockades, are very similar to what occurred with Venezuela. And it does seem to indicate a bit of a pattern that we've been seeing, which almost certainly indicates that some type of conflict or intervention is brewing on the horizon. This is a big thing that we saw during Q2. So it's kind of the buildup, putting all the different pieces into place. We also saw escalation with Greenland as the expansionist and annexation based rhetoric that the American government has been deploying has continued. We also saw escalation with Greenland. Now, with Greenland, they've been trying to placate the Trump administration for a while. They've signed a new mineral deal. They've talked about their continued willingness to host U.S. bases. However, that has not seemed to stop the annexation rhetoric that we've been seeing out of the Trump administration. And the continued push for this annexation has harmed relations between the U.S. and not only Greenland, but also its European neighbors. Because, as I'm sure you're no doubt aware, Greenland is not only a NATO ally, it is also a constituent country within the Kingdom of Denmark, which makes this an EU problem. We saw places like France deploy troops to Greenland as a bit of a show of force, which is not the type of thing you want to be seeing between NATO allies. So while it is pretty unlikely that any type of significant military escalation or intervention would ever occur on Greenland, it does show a trend toward diplomatic escalation between the U.S. and its North American and European allies. Uh, in terms of the North American allies themselves, we have been seeing a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to escalation and de escalation. After months of U.S. economic policy that has caused quite a lot of pain, both domestically and for its North American allies, we have seen a growing interest in reestablishing positive economic ties with Washington from Mexico and from Canada. Recently, we've been seeing some positive rhetoric and quite a shift in rhetoric come out of Ottawa, saying that the United States is one of its most important trading partners and how they want to be able to maintain positive economic relationship. This is a pretty sharp deviation from Carney's previous pretty hawkish rhetoric towards the U.S. In response to the Trump administration's many escalations toward Canada. So we're beginning to see kind of what looks like at the beginning stages of economic de-escalation as Mexico and Canada try to renegotiate the North American trade agreements that were very heavily altered and disrupted during the first Trump administration. And then with the institution of the America First tariff policy, we saw continued escalation. But now we're starting to see what might look like the beginning of, if not significant economic de escalation, at least a shift towards a more positive rhetoric as all sides are interested in trying to maintain positive economic relationships, particularly in regards to the way that the Iran war has negatively affected the whole of the North American continent economically. They're trying to kind of shore up their domestic supplies there. So those type of tensions have been reducing economically. However, the fact that the trade sanctions still exist is a very big problem for America's North American allies. It is causing a lot of shortages, a lot of job loss on both sides of the border. So it is still tenuous. However, we might be seeing a shift toward potentially more positive rhetoric coming out of the economic front.
Right, so that actually brings us really nicely into the assessment for Q3. So, in terms of, so obviously there's a lot to cover, right? And a lot of different scenarios could happen in different areas. You know, the US might act one way with regards to Cuba and another with regards to Greenland. But if you take it as a whole, with the US at its core, how do you see the Americas going forward into Q3? You mentioned that potentially things could stabilize between the US, Canada, and Mexico at least.
Yeah, there is the possibility for that. So, starting off with escalation. This is kind of a mixed bag, and this really could go either way here. So, what we're seeing here between the U.S. and Cuba is very tenuous. Right now, the U.S. is heavily distracted with Iran, both materially and diplomatically. It is taking up a lot of the news outlet. And right now, they need a little bit of time before they can mobilize any type of significant pressure against Cuba. They had built up quite the diplomatic and the military justification for intervening in Cuba, much the same way that they had in Venezuela, as we have already mentioned. But the Iran war somewhat derailed those ambitions. Now, what we're seeing is now that the Iran war is coming to an end, or at least is appearing to come to some type of an end, we might be seeing the possibility for this type of intervention to now resume, be initiated. However, this is going to be very contingent on whether or not the Trump administration feels like it is capable of achieving this both diplomatically and militarily. It is quite possible that the continued economic consequences and diplomatic pressures from the Iran war keep the United States sufficiently distracted that hostility against Cuba is kept at bay for the time being, while it is more distracted with its principal economic and military issues. Or there is the possibility that as peace with Iran becomes more material, and as the Trump administration is looking very desperate for a win prior to the 2026 midterms, it is very possible that we could see that intervention occur regardless. So this really kind of comes down to whether or not the Trump administration feels like it is both capable of doing so and whether or not they feel that Cuba will serve as a valuable win for them. It really kind of comes to it could go either way, but it really is it's looking very much down to the wire. Right net for the immediate future though, it does look like the status quo is holding, but the status quo itself is very tenuous as many of the pieces have already been laid in place for some type of intervention to occur. So we'll be seeing in the future how that pans out in terms of the de-escalatory possibilities. As we mentioned before, the de-escalation is very much in the economic front rather than the security front. It is increasingly likely that we're going to be seeing some form of economic de-escalation, particularly with the United States' largest trading partners. This also factors in to Venezuela. Venezuela has been continuing on the kind of the status quo path of building better relations with the United States following the arrest of Nicolas Maduro. Within Venezuela itself, we've been seeing a fair amount of de escalation as not only the government and economy have been stabilizing, and we've seen a lot of foreign investment come in, but we've also been seeing a sort of soft purge of the top ranks of both the military and the civil authority within Venezuela, as many Maduro era appointees are being quietly removed by the new Rodriguez administration. However, this might be tempered somewhat by the very recent earthquake that killed hundreds of people in Venezuela. Also, in a broader sense, exposed a lot of weaknesses inherent to the regime in the way that it has been able to handle this crisis. There's faced a lot of criticism, so we'll be seeing how that plays into the people's feeling towards the new government. However, Venezuela broadly still has been seeing a moderate amount of de escalation.
Sebastian, you wanted to come in here.
Yeah, I'd like to just add to Jared. I think you framed the situation in Cuba and going through Trump's decision making very well. But something to consider as well is that Venezuela and Cuba is very easy to draw parallels in terms of maybe the campaign against Maduro in January and say like, oh, there might be possibilities for a similar type of operation in the future, whether like in Q3 or in the future. But the issue is that I just want to quickly highlight that the governments and the structures that are in place in Maduro, Venezuela, and the current Cuban regime are very different, because I think Maduro was a little bit of like a cult of personality, and the decapitation campaign worked well because once you get rid of him, there was a contingent who was willing to work with the U.S., maybe by force, but like there was an opportunity to move forward. I don't really see the same with Cuba. If they were to do a similar type of campaign here, you might end up with like so much more institutionalized model here that runs deeper than just the head of state. And in this case, you might find like whether it's even from the citizens who will face even more instability and humanitarian crisis, but also a feeling of nationalism and a kind of a pushback against U.S. intervention. I mean, dating back to like Bay of Pigs, right? And for that, I think it would lead to more of a protracted conflict and not this arc of immediate destabilization followed by this stabilization that followed afterwards in Venezuela. So I wanted to quell this notion of this parallel here and show that there might be actually other things at play in this situation.
Yeah, thank you very much. You bring up some very good points, and this is actually coming into the next section that I was talking about here. Is you're very correct in pointing out that while there are parallels, there are also variables that make the two countries different. Adding on to what you just said, one of the very important details that would make American intervention in Cuba different is the fact that, as you kind of touched on, the civilian population is not quite as nihilistic about their government as was the case with the Maduro regime. In addition to that, the United States intervention would need to follow a likely more of a seizing of the government to be able to establish a new regime rather than having a lot of support on the ground. There is also the possibility that intervention could come in the form of coercive ultimatums that could force the Cuban government to capitulate to certain demands to avoid a certain conflict. So a sort of a carrot and stick approach with various threats being made. That is also a possibility or that is a way that the intervention could manifest. It is exceptionally unlikely, in my view, that the United States would commit to a full-scale military intervention in Cuba the same way that they did in Iran. Mostly not because they lack the material capacity to do so. The Cuban military is not very formidable. It's more to the effect that the war in Iran has proven exceptionally unpopular with the American people, and it is extremely unlikely, in my view, that the United States population would view a full scale military intervention as a positive development, even with Trump's more supportive base. So, intervention within Cuba, should it come within the next quarter, will likely take the form of either a coercive military threat backed up by maybe potentially limited strikes or a attempt to decapitate their high command in a way that would allow a seizure of authority. I don't view it as a perfect analogy or analogous to how it operated in Cuba. So thank you for pointing that out.
Well, and within all of this, there's obviously there's the United States itself, and you mentioned domestically how another military intervention would be unpopular. Let's talk about the United States, domestically speaking. Obviously, as you're right, that throughout the past quarter, we've seen ever decreasing levels of popularity of the administration's war efforts in Iran. I think you are right in saying that an intervention in Cuba would be equally unpopular. How does that relate, in your view, to the US as a whole in terms of how it's been on a potentially stabilizing or destabilizing path with regards to the state?
Yeah, so throughout Q2, we saw moderate destabilization within the United States domestically. Much of this was driven by the economic effects of the Iran war. We saw a substantial rise in the cost of living. And not only in the cost of living, it's very important to actually dig into how the United States infrastructure operates. The United States, as a very low public transportation type of network, as a very large country that is very dependent on like expansive supply lines, the U.S. is very dependent on petroleum for being able to maintain even the basic functionings of a lot of its towns, particularly its smaller towns. They're very, very dependent on the massive U.S. trucking network, which is of course very dependent on expensive diesel fuel. So the rise in the cost of oil has not just affected oil prices in a vacuum; it has affected every aspect of the American economy. Cost of goods for basically everything is up several percentage points, and the American electorate is really feeling this. This has caused one of the biggest forms of destabilization, both politically and economically, that we've seen. In addition to that, we've seen pretty substantial political destabilization as both the Republicans and the Democrats have begun a sort of widespread gerrymandering campaign. This was kicked off by attempts in Texas to produce a heavily gerrymandered map. This was then retaliated against by elements within California. And from there, it was kind of off to the races. And we have now seen many states engage in this widespread gerrymandering. It is threatening to upend a lot of trust in the American democratic system, as many people are feeling increasingly unrepresented as states with very, very large voting blocks of one party or another are becoming increasingly disenfranchised within the American voting system. This is contributing to a growing distrust of democratic institutions that we've been seeing in the United States, and it's posing a very serious problem. And while it might produce immediate political advantages for whichever side can more heavily gerrymander the system, this is likely to cause increasing widespread and long term destabilization and distrust in democratic institutions as a whole. And when you take all this together, between the gerrymandering campaigns, between the high rising cost of living crisis that we've been seeing, it is very likely that the Republicans will perform exceptionally poorly in the midterms elections, particularly within the House. We're likely to see a loss of Republican control there. The Senate, while it is unlikely that the Republicans will necessarily lose the Senate, it does show quite a fracturing of the popularity and ability of the Trump administration to operate effectively within the U.S. domestically.
So turning now, I wanted to look at the Indo-Pacific as a region before coming back to this issue of transatlantic tensions, and I want to get your thoughts on all of that, Andrew. But before we do, let's have a look at the Indo-Pacific. So the region as a whole remained more or less in its status quo scenario throughout the past quarter. US-China relations were broadly speaking fairly stable, and this was largely due to this anticipated summit between President Trump and President Xi back in mid-May, and that was something that was long awaited and then finally took place, resulting in essentially an extension of the trade truce that was set out last year, as well as a few new bilateral trade cooperation frameworks. Now, as a whole, in the Indo-Pacific, the US sought to reassure its allies of its continued defense commitment. Though I have to say that an interesting quirk we saw was following the summit, the US did delay an anticipated arms sale to Taiwan worth approximately $14 billion. And so this marked essentially the first time that the US was taking Chinese considerations into its arms sales to Taiwan. So definitely a notable deviation from a status quo, but largely speaking, the relationship stayed fairly stable. Taiwan, on its end, passed a special defense budget of $25 billion. Now, this was something that had been talked about for essentially the past year in response to the US's push for more defense spending by its allies in the region. The $25 billion did fall short of expectations, however. The government was pushing for $40 billion, but the opposition parties in the Legislative Yuan, in the parliament in Taiwan, basically brought the number down. And then another hotspot within the region that we kept an eye on throughout the quarter was tensions between Japan and China. China further tightened dual-use technology exports to Japan, while Tokyo, on its end, deepened intelligence sharing with the Philippines, and also released a bunch of amendments to its constitution allowing for easier exports of defensive capabilities and lethal weapons. And then finally, I should say that China did continue some of its engagement with the EU, continuing negotiations on trade, with the EU announcing plans to eventually reduce critical technologies imports from China. So, trade continued, but that tension remains and will likely remain going forward. And this brings me to the assessment going into Q3. Now, it looks like Q3 is going to likely remain within this status quo scenario. Why is that? That is likely because of a new summit between Trump and Xi that will happen in the end of September, this time in Washington, D.C. And as we have mentioned, both sides, despite their differences on certain issues, despite odd blips, tit-for-tat moves and escalations, both sides actually do want to keep the trade relationship at the very least stable. I think with the war in Iran, which has impacted both the US and China, there is appetite on both sides for that to maintain. That being said, there is always a chance of hybrid escalation, as I mentioned, escalating here and there. The US is actually going to likely impose new tariffs under Section 301 of the Trade Act, which may cause some response in kind by China. We already know that Beijing has said that it would not take kindly to that. And it is possible that China and the US may tighten export controls ahead of the September summit for increased leverage. That summit is also going to be a big culprit for the diplomatic de-escalation scenario remaining high. The summit will likely be used to further some of the frameworks agreed on during this past summit in May, possibly an establishment or at least progress of a potential board of investment, and a potential formalization of a communication channel with regards to crisis communications regarding Taiwan. And finally, I should say that the military escalation, as always, remains the lowest for the region. Indo-Pacific countries will likely still make efforts to increase their defensive capabilities, including with bilateral agreements of the kind that we've seen between Japan and the Philippines. Such moves may result in condemnation by Beijing, but they are unlikely to provoke a strong kinetic response. Military deployments by China are, however, likely to continue around Japan if Japan furthers its defense overhaul. And another hotspot to keep an eye on is the Korean Peninsula, where we may see further integration by North Korean military of AI technologies and experiences gained from its intervention in Ukraine. So as a whole, lots to keep an eye on, but that main date to keep in mind is the summit between Trump and Xi at the end of September. And finally, I wanted to round up the conversation by turning it back to you, Andrew, for the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the broader outlook with regards to transatlantic relations. So we already talked with Jared about some of the tensions that have emerged between the US and Europe over the past quarter. This is something that you've also covered quite extensively. So can you just give us a reminder of transatlantic relations over the past quarter, especially as it relates to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine?
Yeah, so we saw a significant amount of tension between the United States and its NATO allies, in particular with the US and Germany, and that contention centered primarily on the US's commitment, or perhaps we should say perceived lack of commitment to European. We saw a number of threats from Trump to reduce the force presence of the U.S. on the continent, again, particularly in Germany. And then we saw the cancellation and then rescheduling of a few different U.S. troop deployments to their European rotations. And that trend, more on this in a minute, but that trend is also likely to continue into the third quarter of this year. Now, looking at the war in Russia and Ukraine itself, Ukraine has very notably demonstrated an increased ability to conduct effective drone operations in Moscow and against critical infrastructure in Russia. Now, someone who just kind of casually checks in on these things might say, well, haven't they been doing that all along? Yes, but there is a notable escalation on both of those points. One, they're simply getting through Moscow's air defenses at a much more consistent rate. They are hitting targets within the Moscow region that they have not in the past, including key energy infrastructure, and these make for very dramatic footage on social media, which in all seriousness is also an effect that the Ukrainians are going for, in addition to the actual physical damage to Russian infrastructure. On that note, we've also seen a very significant escalation from Ukraine's drone campaign in Crimea. The Ukrainians have just come out and said that their goal is to sever any Russian connection from Russian territory into occupied Crimea. There's been a significant increase in strikes. Putin himself has publicly commented on the effectiveness of those strikes. Of course, he did not say that they were effective, but he has publicly acknowledged the fuel shortages and the other material hardships that are now emerging in the occupied Crimean territory and parts of Russia as a result of these strikes. Very interestingly, we saw Ukraine deepen its security partnerships with a number of Arab states, especially in the Gulf. These deals centered primarily over drone defense, I'm sure offensive capabilities as well, and industrial cooperation. And again, this came out of the U.S.-Israel war against Iran. A lot of America's traditional and long-standing partners in the regions very quickly turned to the Ukrainians to get some of that know-how and that battlefield experience that they've gained over the last several years. Now, the other thing that must be said is that the diplomatic push from the U.S. to end the war has effectively ceased over the quarter, at least in a meaningful way. And again, we also saw that sputter out right around the time that the U.S. and Israel started the war with Iran. We've talked about this in other episodes, but I think part of that has to do with the unique way that the Trump administration, and especially the second Trump administration, even compared to the first one, conducts diplomacy by relying on a few handful of individuals, primarily Steve Witkoff and the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and the administration's distrust of American diplomatic institutions and career diplomats. And finally, one more note that we need to discuss. The Hungarian elections are something that now feels like a long time ago, but the defeat of Viktor Orban, really, you can't really stress how significant of a shift that is inside the European Union itself in a number of ways, but how it relates to Ukraine. Almost right away, Peter Magyar lifted holds that Hungary, but because of Budapest, the EU had in place on aid to Ukraine. So that's now another avenue of approach for continued EU aid to Ukraine is now open.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Yeah, I also wanted to point out that one of the issues that we're seeing already with the Hungarian situation is even as Hungary is now adopting a more pro-EU stance with its new government, the recent Bulgarian elections have brought into power a government which is increasingly Eurosceptic and has already begun making threats to veto certain provisions that would begin to assist Ukraine. So we are seeing the possibility that Bulgaria will potentially assume Orban's place as a sort of spoiler effect within the EU system.
Yeah, thank you both. Yeah, all of that very important stuff, especially what you both mentioned with regards to the EU. I will note on your last point, Jared, that I think Bulgaria is a lot more contingent on or needing of EU support for its own domestic funding. They just recently adopted the euro as well. So I think there may be more hesitancy compared to Orban's government with regards to putting any stopper in the EU's agenda. But yes, definitely, if there's going to be a spoiler from within the EU, it could come from Bulgaria, as you mentioned. Absolutely. So Andrew, turning it back to you here quickly, in terms of what we're likely to see in Q3 regarding the overall region, what do you think is the most likely scenario going forward?
So the most likely scenario for the next part of this year is, for the first time in a while, military escalation, and there's a few reasons for that. One, there's a very high likelihood that Ukraine will continue to escalate its drone campaign, specifically against Moscow, St. Petersburg, and occupied Crimea. We will likely see continued ramifications from that inside Russia and on the Russian economy and in the day-to-day lives of Russians in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And it's important to keep in mind that the social contract, so to speak, between Putin and the populations, at least of those cities at the start of the war, was essentially mind your own business and life will continue on here as normal. The Kremlin is right now under significant stress compared to domestically with these concerns compared to where it was at the beginning of the war, or even 1 year or 6 months ago. So we will certainly see an escalation on that front. Ukraine has also demonstrated an increased ability to effectively strike Russian army logistic nodes throughout occupied territory inside Ukraine. Russia, for its part, will continue to escalate the intensity of its bombardment against Ukrainian cities. And again, someone might hear that and say, haven't they been doing that all along? Yes, but even from the baseline that the Russians have established over the course of this war, over the last quarter, we've seen a significant escalation, especially with bombardment against Kyiv, again, in direct response from the effectiveness of those Ukrainian strikes in Moscow. So we will almost certainly see an escalation on both of those fronts. Ukrainian commanders are publicly very confident that they are going to be able to effectively exploit perceived Russian weaknesses on the ground and certainly continue to inflict significant disproportionate casualties against against the Russians. The Russians, for their part, it seems are almost incapable of demonstrating innovation when it comes to their TTPs on the ground. I saw an interesting quote from a Ukrainian POW in Russia who told his interrogators that, basically you bring a truckload of men to the front and we bring a truckload of FPV drones. It is unlikely, again, certainly not impossible, stranger things have happened, but it is unlikely that we will see a significant reversal of battlefield fortunes for Ukraine in the sense of a massive routing of the Russian army. Again, that is not impossible. It's just unlikely from where things stand at the moment. However, the overall shift in momentum is likely to carry on with the Ukrainian armed forces, at least up until the onset of winter of this year.
Yeah, absolutely. So things will likely escalate before they de-escalate. So we'll be asking you for any updates on that front going forward. And I should note that obviously Q3 will start off with the NATO summit in Ankara. So we will likely hear more about US force positioning within Europe and how it relates to transatlantic ties as a whole. I think we've covered a lot in today's episode. I think we'll have to wrap it up there for today. As a reminder to our listeners, if you'd like a more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to all of the hotspots that we covered today, please check our Q3 forecast report on our website at newlinesinstitute.org, where you can also register to receive our weekly newsletter and access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for regular updates around the world. Look forward to our subsequent episodes on the Q3 report, where we will be tackling, amongst others, Bolivia, Morocco, and other countries within the African continent. Thank you all, Andrew, Jared, and Sebastian, for joining me. Thank you all for listening to me, and take care.